Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Tamara Rosevan. U.S. President Donald Trump's ties with Russia go back decades. In the 1980s, he was looking to partner up with the Soviet authorities to build a luxury hotel. And as late as January 2016, Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, asked Putin's press secretary to help him bring to life the Trump-Moscow project. Now, working with Russian authorities to build a hotel and getting help from the Kremlin to win an election are two very different things. This is why special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into collusion between the Trump campaign team and Russia's meddling in the U.S. election is no easy task. One award-winning journalist's investigative reporting suggests there's compelling evidence and incriminating facts which point at collusion between Trump and Russia. Joining us from London via Skype is Luke Harding, foreign correspondent for The Guardian and author of the New York Times bestseller Collusion: How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win. We're joined now. Thank you so much for joining me, Luke.
Hi, good to be with you.
So, let's talk about Paul Manafort. He was the one who helped Viktor Yanukovych win the prime minister's post in Ukraine in 2006. Now, then he worked on Donald Trump's campaign. Now, you've met him personally during your time here in Kiev. Apart from, the lucrative payoff that he received for working for Yanukovych, what made him the ideal candidate to help clean up Yanukovych's thuggish image?
Well, as you say, I met Paul Manafort in your town, in Kiev, in 2008. At that point, Yanukovych was wanting to be kind of prime minister again. There was an election, and Manafort had been brought in to basically refashion his image. His sort of profile was that of a kind of classic post-Soviet politician thug, if you like, and Manafort's task was to kind of refashion him as a kind of Western statesman. And I think he did that job rather well. He told me that Yanukovych was progressive, was a Democrat, was a good guy. And of course, we all know what happened next. He became president in 2010. He jailed Yulia Tymoshenko, and he really kind of ran a very kleptocratic regime where he and his family made billions and billions of dollars. And I think the thing about Paul Manafort is that he's a clever guy, but he's also highly amoral, and his next client was Donald Trump.
And that's the kind of interesting connection there. Now, he's also connected to Kremlin confidant Oleg Deripaska, who's a billionaire businessman, and he's got a connection to Vladimir Putin, and he's very, very wealthy. Now, he was the kind of the connection between Paul Manafort and Deripaska is quite interesting. Can you tell us more about the kind of history of cooperation during the Yanukovych era, based on your conversations with Manafort in Kiev back in 2008?
Well, we didn't talk about that, but what's come out sort of subsequently is that Manafort's first client was Deripaska, and you're right. I mean, of course, Deripaska is a very famous Russian oligarch, and it's impossible to be a billionaire in the Russian system without having good, close relations with the presidential administration and with Putin personally. So this channel existed. We're talking about 10 years ago. And this channel continued. And I think what's really interesting is that we now know from emails that have been released as part of the kind of congressional investigation that Manafort, when he was running Trump's campaign, was secretly offering Deripaska private briefing, the inside track, if you like, on what Trump was doing.
What was he going to get in return for that? Sorry, what was he going to get in return for these, alleged conversations and insiders' knowledge of what was going on in the Donald Trump campaign?
Well, we don't know. I mean, this is something that Bob Mueller, the special counsel, is investigating. Obviously, Paul Manafort has been charged with money laundering, very large sums, much of it, you might say, Ukrainian money, flowing via a series of offshore accounts to Paul Manafort in America. Now, Manafort says, his lawyer says, this meeting never happened. This is regular, routine stuff. But I think the big question which kind of haunts Donald Trump is, why did Manafort become campaign manager, given the fact that of all people in America, big country, 300 million people, he probably had the best connections to Moscow, to Kiev, and to Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. And that's a kind of mystery I'm very keen to get the answer to.
Right. And you mentioned in your book this KGB checklist and of people that they were looking to recruit, back in the 80s, throughout the past decades. And does Paul Manafort fit that criteria?
I don't think Manafort necessarily fits that criteria. I mean, they're quite extensive. I mean, he fits the criteria insofar as he's clearly highly motivated by money. I mean, he's made more money than most people earn in a lifetime through his work in the post-Soviet Union. And bear in mind that when he was in Ukraine, when he was staying in five-star hotel in Kiev, this is someone who doesn't speak Ukrainian or Russian. This is not someone from the neighborhood. He's someone who's kind of brought in from outside. And of course, the reason he was doing it was he was earning very, very large sums of money. But in terms of the person who does fit the profile, more accurately, that's Donald Trump himself. And we know from leaked KGB records from the 1980s that the kind of people that Soviet spies were interested in were people who were vain, ambitious, narcissistic, also motivated by money, perhaps blackmailable, keen on women, and so on. And these memos are being sent out at the same time that, as you mentioned in your introduction, Donald Trump is going to Soviet Russia for the first time.
So Donald Trump fits the KGB criteria for recruitment.
Well, I mean, I don't think we can say recruitment necessarily. There's a scale. We can't assert that Donald Trump is a kind of full-blown agent or anything like that. But what we can say from the files, from vectors I've talked to and other sources, is that Moscow, both during Soviet times and more recently, has been keen to cultivate him for their own purposes. And if you believe the Steele dossier, the dossier for Christopher Steele, the former British intelligence agent, which I think is broadly credible, there's been a kind of transactional relationship going back a long way, but most recently kind of reactivated or kind of re-energized 5 or 6 years ago, and certainly at a time when Donald Trump went back to Moscow in 2013 for the Miss Universe beauty pageant.
Right. Now, in your book, there's a suggestion that, there's no suggestion that there was collusion between Russia and Donald Trump, as the title says, how Russia helped Donald Trump win. But so it's more about how the Kremlin managed to pull it off, rather. So what would you say are the most important and credible pieces of information or evidence that suggests Russia did help Trump win?
Well, I think this was a multi-layered operation. There were several things involved. I mean, the most significantly and importantly, I think, was simply the hack. Now, U.S. intelligence agencies say that two groups, one from the FSB, one from the GRU, deliberately hacked Democratic Party emails, and these were dumped out during the campaign last summer and then again in October to inflict maximum damage on Hillary Clinton, whom, by the way, Vladimir Putin personally loads. Now, that clearly helped Donald Trump. But additionally, we have what you might call a kind of classic penetration exercise with Russian emissaries, some of them intelligence agencies, some of them not, meeting with people from the Trump campaign, including famously Donald Trump Jr. in Trump Tower. We had a Moscow lawyer, Natalia Veselnitskaya, who went to go and see him, but also meeting with Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, Michael Flynn, the disgraced national security advisor, and so on. And so it's clear this was a kind of classic espionage operation. It doesn't mean that Putin is Superman, that he knows everything, that he presses red buttons in a kind of Batcave, but it does mean that these tactics, which worked during the Cold War, are still being employed, and I think last year were pretty successful.
I see. Now, your book also touches on Russian espionage, and that's something that you've yourself experienced when you were reporting for The Guardian in Moscow. That's no secret. You've made it public in interviews, and based on your understanding of the measures that the KGB will go to intimidate, if more evidence emerges of Russian meddling in the U.S. elections, how far will the KGB go to silence these, potential witnesses or, et cetera, or evidence, or try to conceal evidence?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Of course, it's the FSB now, not the KGB, although actually in terms of mentality and methods, they're very, very similar indeed. I think what's happened over the last year is that it's almost, there are two halves of this story. There's the American story, which Robert Mueller is pursuing, I think quite successfully, quite aggressively. We've had 4 indictments already. And the Americans in this story are, I would say, less clever, less experienced than their Russian counterparts. And I think what happened from the Kremlin end was really a sort of classic Secret Service operation. Now, everybody in Moscow perfectly understands that if you are someone working inside the Russian intelligence apparatus and you talk to either the CIA or MI6 or indeed to Western journalists, then I think everyone understands punishment is for that kind of behavior. And so far, really, very little from Moscow has kind of leaked, and I don't expect it to until the Putin government finally collapses. And you don't know, I don't know when that's going to be, but I think we can probably agree it's not happening anytime soon.
It's certainly not happening during the upcoming elections in Russia, as we've seen. Thank you so much for joining me today. Your book is still on the bestsellers list, on the New York Times bestsellers list. It's an amazing book. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
That was Luke Harding, the Guardian foreign correspondent, and we've been discussing his latest book, Collusion: How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win.